Ramstein Air Base was alive with the constant hum of aircraft engines, their raw power filling the air with a sense of purpose. The smell of jet fuel clung to everything: the concrete floors, the hangar walls, and the very air itself. For Private Jenkins, it was the first time truly standing in the belly of the beast, feeling the weight of military life pressing down on him. The base was a place of routine, precision, and power, and Jenkins, freshly out of tech school, was eager to prove himself. His uniform was crisp, untouched by the dust of deployment. He walked through the hangar with his chest out, the newness of it all giving him an unwarranted confidence. He was fresh, sure, but he was also cocky. As he made his way across the hangar, he couldn't help but notice her. Lieutenant Maya Reyes stood a few yards away, clipboard in hand, inspecting some parts with a calm, methodical focus. She was different from the others, quiet, efficient, and entirely unimpressive to the young private's eyes. Her forearms were covered in scars, jagged and uneven, marks that looked like they had been earned in some kind of brutal accident. Jenkins had heard the rumors everyone had. She was just a maintenance officer, right? It didn't make sense to him why someone with those kinds of scars would be working on base maintenance and not commanding an operation somewhere far, more prestigious. To Jenkins, those scars weren't badges of honor. They were evidence of something unremarkable, something he could mock. With a quick glance toward his group of fellow privates, Jenkins felt the surge of superiority course through him. He was the one in charge now, wasn't he? His voice, slightly louder than necessary, carried through the hangar with ease, making sure to land right where Reyes was working. "Hey, look at Lieutenant Papercuts," he sneered, smirking to his group. "What kind of maintenance officer gets herself shredded by barbed wire?" His friends chuckled softly, exchanging knowing glances. It wasn't the first time they had made light of the women on base. But Reyes was different. She didn't try to fit in, didn't crack jokes, didn't even try to make herself seen. As he continued to walk, Jenkins felt the usual pride that came with being a new recruit. He had the newest gear, the freshest boots. He had something to prove, and he was determined to make sure everyone noticed. But Reyes, she just stood there, silent and unmoving, not acknowledging his words. That was almost worse, Jenkins thought. Not even a reaction. It felt like he couldn't get under her skin, and that frustrated him. The maintenance bay was bustling as usual, but there was something different about the way Reyes moved. She was efficient, yes, but it wasn't just that. She had a purpose. Every motion was deliberate. Every task was carried out with a level of focus Jenkins hadn't yet seen in anyone else. It was as if the hangar around her didn't exist, and though she was quiet, there was something intimidating in the way she held herself. She was calm, almost eerily so, in contrast to Jenkins and his group, who were still trying to find their place by cracking jokes and looking for the next thing to laugh about. "Private Jenkins," a voice called out. Staff Sergeant Davis, standing nearby, turned to look at the group of privates with a stern expression. "You better get your head in the game. You're not here for a comedy show." Jenkins snapped to attention. The sudden shift from his carefree attitude to the responsibility of military. Life still a bit jarring. But as soon as Reyes passed by, Jenkins couldn't help himself. The words escaped before he could stop them. "Careful with those maintenance reports. Lieutenant," he called out, making sure his voice carried just enough to be heard by her, but not enough to get him in trouble. "Looks like you already lost one fight with some paperwork." He chuckled, certain that it would get a laugh from his peers. But the hangar didn't fall silent. It didn't stop either. But there was a noticeable shift. Senior NCOs stopped for just a moment, the noise around them suddenly quieter. Eyes darted to Reyes, then to Jenkins, and something shifted in the air, something that made Jenkins's skin prickle. He couldn't place it, but he could feel the weight of the moment shift. Reyes didn't react. She didn't even flinch. She simply turned, her gaze meeting his. There was no anger in her eyes, no sign of offense. She simply assessed him, quietly. Jenkins, normally so confident, suddenly felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was something unsettling in her calm, something that left him off balance. For the first time, he felt unsure, but he couldn't understand why. With nothing more than a quiet acknowledgement of his presence, she turned and continued her work. Jenkins stood there for a moment, watching her retreating form, still unsure of what had just happened. The ease with which she had turned from his mockery made him uncomfortable. It wasn't the usual response, the kind that came with a glare or a snappy retort. She had ignored him, sure, but there was something in the way she held herself that didn't add up. What's her problem? Jenkins muttered under his breath as he turned to his buddies, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered in the air. One of the older crew chiefs, working nearby, shook his head without looking up. "You might want to ease up, kid," he said, his voice low. "You don't know her. Not everyone is who they seem." Jenkins scoffed, but there was something in the crew chief's tone that made him pause. He didn't like being told what to do. But the warning lingered in his mind. Why was everyone so careful around Reyes? Why was she treated differently? It didn't make sense. To him, she was just another officer in a maintenance uniform, working alongside the rest of the techs. As the hours passed, Jenkins kept his distance but couldn't help stealing glances at Reyes. She worked with a focus he couldn't understand. No distractions, no breaks. She simply did her job. And though he tried to ignore it, he began to see the difference in the way senior officers treated her. There was no grudging respect. No backhanded remarks that were typical for new officers. They listened to her. She spoke and they listened. Jenkins felt a growing sense of confusion. How could someone so quiet, so seemingly unremarkable, command this kind of attention? This wasn't the kind of behavior you saw in a regular officer. Not someone who worked on the maintenance side of things. Was there something more to her? He had to know. The day passed in a blur of routine. But Jenkins couldn't stop watching Reyes. His curiosity was eating at him. There was something about her. Something beyond the scars, beyond the quiet demeanor. And it was driving him mad that he couldn't put his finger on it. What was her story? Reyes continued to work, moving from task to task, with an air of dignity that seemed to set her apart from everyone else. No one seemed to question her presence, not even when she stood among the senior officers, quietly reviewing documents or signing off on maintenance reports. No one dared to mock her. They all respected her. But Jenkins, he was too caught up in his own ego to understand it. And that, Jenkins would soon realize, was the first mistake of many. Reyes continued her work in the hangar with the same quiet efficiency that had first caught Jenkins's attention. Every movement was precise, every task completed with minimal disruption, almost like she was in a world of her own. The way she handled the equipment was almost surgical, methodical, and deliberate, never hurried. Jenkins had tried to dismiss her as just another officer in a maintenance unit. But the longer he watched her, the more certain he became that there was something different about her. His days were filled with the constant buzz of military life briefings, routine check-ins, and the occasional task. But between all that, Jenkins couldn't stop thinking about Reyes. She moved through the hangar like she belonged to it, weaving between aircraft with an ease that made it hard to believe she wasn't in charge of some major operation. The senior NCOs respected her in a way he didn't understand, though they barely spoke to her. Every time she passed one of them, they offered a small nod, a glance of acknowledgement that seemed far more meaningful than the casual conversations they had with others. The respect didn't stop with the enlisted men. Even the officers treated her differently. At first, Jenkins thought it was just because she was an officer, but it quickly became clear that wasn't it. Other officers, even those with higher ranks, seemed to defer to her in a way that Jenkins couldn't explain. He watched as Captain Lawson, a senior officer known for his hard-nosed attitude, approached her one afternoon with a file of technical documents. They exchanged a few brief words, with Lawson carefully listening to her suggestions. Afterward, he gave a silent nod and walked off without a word of thanks. His usual confident stride replaced with something more thoughtful. Jenkins felt the puzzle pieces begin to shift, but he still didn't know what to make of it. The curiosity gnawed at him. Each day, as he moved through his duties, he kept his eyes on Reyes, trying to figure out what made her so different from the others. He had mocked her openly in the past, but now, something in her calm demeanor made him hesitant. Jenkins was used to being the center of attention, used to commanding the room with his wit and bravado, but Reyes didn't seem to care for any of that. It was as if she didn't even notice the people around her. She didn't need validation, didn't seek the approval he craved. But it wasn't just her demeanor that made him question her. It was her knowledge, the way she seemed to understand every aspect of the hangar, the aircraft, and the systems they were maintaining. One morning, Jenkins overheard a conversation between Reyes and Master Sergeant Wilkins. She had been discussing the malfunctioning hydraulic system in one of the F-35s. Wilkins, the senior NCO, seemed to be having trouble understanding the problem. But Reyes, in her calm, clear way, laid out the solution step by step. Wilkins listened intently, his usual gruffness replaced with something closer to awe. Jenkins was left speechless. He'd always been told that maintenance officers, like Reyes, didn't get involved in the technical aspects of the aircraft. That was the job of the engineers or the pilots. But Reyes seemed to have a hand in everything. Jenkins had seen her troubleshoot a diagnostic system the other day with an ease that suggested she could have been piloting the aircraft herself. He couldn't fathom how someone with such a quiet, unassuming presence could possess so much technical expertise. The next day, during a routine briefing in the command center, Jenkins's doubts deepened. The briefing had started like any other, with updates on mission schedules, base operations, and a routine update on aircraft maintenance. But when Colonel Harrington, the base commander, began discussing a critical issue with one of the new drones, a problem with its thermal signature, Reyes spoke up. Her voice was calm, but it carried a certain weight. She suggested a modification to the drone's intake manifold, a solution that Jenkins knew had been discussed in the archives but was never implemented. The room went silent for a moment, and Jenkins felt the entire atmosphere shift. He glanced around at the officers, and they were all looking at her with varying degrees of respect and recognition. Colonel Harrington paused, and then, as if coming to some unspoken conclusion, nodded. "Lieutenant Reyes is right," he said. "That could work. We'll implement the adjustment right away." Jenkins' confusion only grew. He had no idea why Colonel Harrington, a man with decades of experience, would so casually defer to someone of Reyes's rank on a matter that involved classified drone systems. It didn't make sense. Reyes was just a maintenance officer, not an engineer or a drone specialist, but her knowledge was undeniable. For the first time, Jenkins began to wonder if he had underestimated her. But even as the respect for her among the senior officers continued to build, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something he wasn't seeing. That afternoon, as Jenkins made his way back to the hangar, he noticed the way the senior NCOs continued to treat Reyes differently. They didn't speak to her the way they spoke to him, or to the other junior officers. It was a subtle difference, a certain level of deference that was reserved only for those who had earned it through experience and respect. Jenkins found himself frustrated, unsure of what to make of the way she was treated. He had always been told that respect in the military was earned, but Reyes didn't seem to be doing anything to actively seek it. It just seemed to follow her, almost as if it was part of her presence. And then, one afternoon, Jenkins found himself face to face with Reyes again, this time in the hangar. As she was discussing the latest maintenance reports with one of the crew chiefs, the usual quiet hum of the base continued around them. But this time, Jenkins couldn't help but listen in. Reyes was calm, even when discussing complex issues with the crew chiefs. There was a certain grace to the way she communicated, a confidence in her knowledge that was far beyond her rank. As Jenkins stood there, watching her, he couldn't deny that his opinion of her was shifting. The mocking comments from days before seemed childish now. The more he observed her, the more he realized how little he understood about her. He had spent so much time trying to make her fit into his preconceived notions. A quiet, unassuming officer with nothing of importance to offer. But the more he saw, the more it became clear that he had misjudged her entirely. It was like a veil had been lifted, but Jenkins still didn't know what lay beneath it. There were layers to Reyes that he couldn't yet understand, and the more he watched her, the more questions he had. But for now, all he could do was watch, unsure of how to approach the woman who had become the subject of his newfound curiosity. One thing was clear. However, Reyes was far more than she seemed, and Jenkins was beginning to realize that the silent hero he had dismissed was someone far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. The briefing room was buzzing with activity as Jenkins found his seat near the back. The familiar hum of voices slowly died down as Colonel Harrington took the podium, his sharp uniform and stern face commanding attention. The room went silent, and Jenkins straightened in his chair, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that had settled over him. Since the last few days, he had been thinking about Reyes nonstop. The way she moved, the way she spoke, something about her was different, and it was gnawing at him. Harrington wasted no time, diving straight into the day's topics. Routine updates, maintenance schedules, training operations, but then the conversation shifted. There was a new issue on the table, something Jenkins hadn't expected. The drone fleet, specifically the new stealth drones, was having a critical issue with their thermal signature. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, or so Jenkins thought. The problem sounded technical, but easy enough to fix. But then, Reyes spoke up. She hadn't been invited to speak. Yet when she did, it was clear that every officer in the room was listening. "If I may, sir," Reyes said, her calm, measured voice cutting through the chatter. The thermal signature issue could be mitigated by reversing the intake, manifold orientation. The words seemed to land like a stone in a still pond, ripples spreading across the room. Jenkins blinked, confused. He couldn't understand why she was even involved in this conversation. She was a maintenance officer, for God's sake. Drones weren't her area. Colonel Harrington, who who had been discussing the issue for the last few minutes, stopped mid-sentence, clearly taken aback. "Go ahead, Lieutenant," he said, but there was a faint hint of impatience in his voice. He didn't expect her to have a solution. But as Reyes continued explaining, detailing the specifics of how the system could be adjusted, Jenkins watched in stunned silence. Her voice was steady as she outlined the modification, giving clear, detailed explanations of how it had worked on earlier prototypes. She referenced blueprints from the archives, confirming that the solution would be compatible with the current models. The technical jargon flew over Jenkins's head, but what shocked him more was the way everyone in the room, even Colonel Harrington, nodded along, acknowledging her authority on the matter. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. No one had questioned her. No one had doubted her. She was a maintenance officer, yet she was speaking like an expert on cutting-edge military technology. After a moment of stunned silence, Colonel Harrington spoke again. His tone changed. "Lieutenant Reyes, you're absolutely right," he said. His voice tinged with a level of respect Jenkins hadn't heard from him before. "We'll implement that adjustment right away." There was no hesitation, no challenge to her words. It was as if her opinion had carried more weight than his own. Jenkins felt his stomach churn. He didn't understand. How could a maintenance officer, someone like Reyes, have that kind of knowledge? He glanced around the room, trying to gauge the reactions of the other officers. Most of them were quiet, but they seemed to share the same sense of awe, the same recognition of the importance of her input. Jenkins felt like an outsider, his confusion deepening by the second. The briefing continued, but Jenkins's mind was no longer on the technical details. His thoughts were racing. He had spent weeks mocking Reyes, thinking she was just another officer with no real skills. He had assumed she was unimportant, her scars just a sign of clumsiness. But now, he realized he had been wrong. He had no idea who she really was or what she was capable of. As the briefing came to an end, Jenkins stood up, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He was lost in thought, replaying the moment in his head, trying to piece together what he had just witnessed. Reyes was more than just a quiet officer. She was someone who commanded respect, someone who had knowledge and skills far beyond what anyone had told him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important, something that went far beyond her role in maintenance. That's when it happened. The door to the briefing room swung open, and the air seemed to shift. Jenkins looked up and saw a figure enter a man whose presence alone commanded attention. General Maxwell Thornton, 4-star commander of European Command, walked in, flanked by his entourage of senior officers. The room snapped to attention as one, and Jenkins' eyes widened. This wasn't a routine visit. This was important. Jenkins stood stiffly, his heart racing as General Thornton made his way to the front. The general's eyes scanned the room, nodding at the officers as he passed by. But then, as his gaze fell on Reyes, something changed. Thornton stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. The silence in the room was palpable. "My God," General Thornton said, his voice low but filled with shock. "Is that really you?" The words hung in the air, and Jenkins froze, his confusion intensifying. Reyes, for her part, remained composed. She gave a small nod, her expression calm but guarded. "It's good to see you, sir," she replied, her voice steady. The room, which had been filled with murmurs of recognition and confusion, fell completely silent. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of what was happening. Jenkins felt a growing sense of unease. He had no idea what was going on, but he could feel the tension building in the air. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything. General Thornton, a man who commanded thousands of soldiers across Europe, did something that Jenkins could not believe. He saluted Reyes, a crisp, respectful salute that no one would ever give to someone of her rank. It was a breach of military protocol so profound that Jenkins could barely process it. He had seen generals salute Medal of Honor recipients, but this was different. Reyes, however, did not return the salute. Instead, she simply acknowledged the gesture, her face betraying no emotion. "Colonel Reyes," General Thornton said warmly, "it's been too long." Jenkins felt his knees go weak. His mind was racing. Colonel Reyes, his lieutenant, the phantom from Operation Blackstone. The stories he had heard in training, the whispers about covert operations and legends that no one could confirm. Were they true? Was she really who everyone seemed to think she was? As the officers in the room watched, trying to process the scene unfolding before them, General Thornton turned to address the group. "For those of you who don't know," he began, his voice firm and full of authority, "you've been working alongside one of the finest tactical minds in our military." Jenkins could hardly breathe. The words didn't make sense. Colonel Reyes led operations that most of you have only heard whispers about. The kind of operations that change history without ever making it into the history books. Jenkins felt his stomach drop. Reyes, the Phantom. The same woman he had mocked and dismissed just days ago. She was a legend, a living, breathing hero, and he had no idea. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind was spinning, and he could barely hear the rest of the briefing. The room was still, but his thoughts were anything but. As General Thornton continued speaking, Jenkins found it hard to focus. His entire perception of Reyes had been turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew about her was wrong. She wasn't just a maintenance officer. She was the heart of something much bigger, something far more important than he could have ever imagined. And as the room filled with whispers of respect and awe, Jenkins was left standing there, a silent witness to the revelation of Reyes's hidden past, a past that would forever change the way he saw her, and perhaps even himself. Jenkins stood outside the maintenance office, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was quiet, save for the distant sounds of workers moving through the hangar, but his mind was anything but. The events of the past few days played over and over in his head, each moment like a punch in the gut. He had made a fool of himself. He had mocked Reyes, not knowing who she was or what she had done. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he was left to face the consequences. He hadn't meant to hurt her. The words had come out in the heat of the moment, the result of his youthful pride and need for validation. But now, after everything that had come to light, he couldn't escape the weight of his actions. He had mocked a hero, a living legend, and in doing so, he had lost something important, his own sense of humility. Jenkins took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the door handle. He hesitated for just a moment, unsure of what he would say, or if she would even want to hear it. He had to face her. He had to make things right. But how? What could he possibly say that would make up for the insults? For the disrespect, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was quiet, dimly lit by the overhead lights that flickered every few seconds. Reyes was at her desk, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. Her posture was impeccable, her expression neutral as always. She didn't look up when Jenkins entered. It was as if she had expected him. "Lieutenant," Jenkins said, his voice unsteady. "Can we talk?" Reyes slowly raised her head, her gaze meeting his without a hint of surprise. She didn't speak at first, but she didn't need to. Her calm presence filled the room, steadying Jenkins even as his nerves threatened to overwhelm him. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words rushing out before he could stop them. "I've been a complete idiot. I've made jokes about you, about your scars. I thought you were just another officer, someone I could mock for a laugh. I didn't know who you really were. I didn't know what you've done." Reyes didn't respond immediately, her gaze never wavering from his. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably under her quiet stare, the weight of his own ignorance pressing down on him. The silence stretched out, almost unbearable. He wanted to say more, to make her understand how sorry he was, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, Reyes spoke. Her voice was as steady and composed as always. But there was something in it that made Jenkins pause. "It's not about what you know. Private," she said. "It's about how you treat people, especially when you don't know anything about them." Jenkins' stomach sank at the simplicity of her words. It was a truth he had never considered. He had spent so much time focusing on himself, on proving something to others, that he hadn't stopped to think about how his words and actions affected the people around him. Reyes's scars were a reminder of the things she had survived, the battles she had fought, and he had mocked them, without a second thought. "I was wrong," Jenkins said quietly, his voice full of regret. "I didn't see you for who you really are. I was too busy making fun of you to see that you're not just some maintenance officer. You're a hero." Reyes didn't flinch at the word. She didn't even smile. She just nodded slightly, acknowledging his apology without the need for words. "The hardest battles aren't the ones you see," she said, her voice softer now. "They're the ones you fight within yourself. You'll find your real strength when you stop looking for it in the wrong places." Jenkins swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't realized how much he had been chasing validation, how much of his arrogance had been a defense mechanism to cover up his own insecurities. He had wanted to be seen, to be recognized, but in doing so, he had failed to see the people around him for who they truly were. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to impress people, trying to act like I know everything, but I don't know anything." Reyes studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, She spoke again, her tone more gentle this time. It's not about knowing everything. It's about doing what needs to be done. You don't have to be the loudest or the smartest. You just have to be good at what you do and respect those around you. That's where your strength lies. Jenkins nodded, the weight of her advice sinking in. He hadn't realized how much he had underestimated her. It wasn't just her scars or her quiet demeanor that set her apart. It was her integrity, her focus on doing the right thing, even when no one was looking. He had been too busy trying to prove himself to others to see the true measure of strength in someone like Reyes. "I'm sorry," he said again, the words feeling more sincere this time. "I won't make that mistake again." Reyes didn't answer, but the slightest hint of acknowledgement flickered in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything more. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. She had already forgiven him. It was Jenkins who had to learn to forgive himself. As he turned to leave, Jenkins felt a shift inside him. The arrogance that had once defined him seemed to melt away, replaced by a quiet resolve. He had been given a second chance to do things right, and he wasn't going to waste it. Reyes had shown him that true strength didn't come from boasting or seeking recognition. It came from quietly doing the right thing, no matter who was watching. Outside the office, Jenkins paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The hallway felt different now, less oppressive, more hopeful. He still had a long way to go, but he was finally starting to understand what it meant to serve with humility. He wasn't just a private anymore. He was part of something bigger, and it was time he started acting like it. As he walked down the hall, he glanced back at Reyes's office, her figure still visible through the glass. She hadn't changed, but he had, and for the first time, he felt like he was ready to be the kind of soldier she had always been, quiet, strong, and focused on the task at hand. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his career, and he owed it all to the woman he had once mocked. The weeks that followed Jenkins' apology marked a quiet but significant shift. In his perspective, it wasn't immediate, and it wasn't loud. It was subtle, a small change in the way he carried himself, a shift in how he saw the people around him, especially Reyes. The more he observed her, the more he realized how little he had understood about the true nature of strength and skill. The truth, he now saw, wasn't in the flashy displays of power or the loudest voices, but in quiet consistency and an unwavering commitment to the task at hand. Jenkins had been assigned to help with the training of a new batch of technicians. It was part of his job, but also a test of his maturity and his ability to lead. As part of his duties, he found himself in the same hangar as Reyes, working on one of the newly arrived F-35s, a complex machine requiring precise and careful attention. At first, he was focused solely on the mechanics of the task, thinking about the procedures and parts he needed to check, but slowly, his attention was drawn to Reyes, who was working with the new trainees. She was standing at the front of a small group of young technicians, her posture impeccable as she explained a tricky procedure. She didn't need to raise her voice or make grand gestures. Her instructions were clear, her words simple but effective, as she guided the group through the process of troubleshooting a delicate electrical issue. She didn't give orders. She didn't demand respect. Instead, she earned it through her actions, quietly demonstrating her expertise without needing to call attention to herself. Jenkins watched her from across the hangar, his respect growing steadily with each movement. What struck him most was her patience. The young technicians made mistakes, as they all did, especially when dealing with complex machinery, but Reyes never showed frustration. When one of them struggled to align a diagnostic system, she offered a calm suggestion, guiding them through the steps without a hint of impatience. She corrected them with the same steady voice, no more forceful than necessary. When another technician seemed overwhelmed by a difficult task, Reyes simply stood beside him, her presence a quiet source of reassurance. She never rushed anyone, never raised her voice. She allowed the team to learn at their own pace, offering her knowledge like a gift, not a demand. Jenkins had heard the term quiet strength before, but it had always felt abstract to him. He thought strength was about power, the loud, attention-grabbing kind. But now, watching Reyes, he saw it in a different light. Her strength didn't come from imposing her will on others. It came from her ability to stay calm under pressure, to guide others without needing to dominate the conversation. She never shouted to be heard. Her actions spoke far louder than words could ever do. The contrast between Reyes's calm, collected demeanor and the way Jenkins had once tried to lead through bravado and an inflated sense of importance was stark. He realized now that his earlier approach had been a form of weakness, not strength. He had tried to assert his authority by showing off, by making people laugh or by boasting about what he could do. But Reyes didn't need any of that. She simply did the work. She led through her example, and people followed her not because they had to, but because they respected her competence and her character. Jenkins began to reflect on how he had treated others in the past. He had been quick to judge, quick to mock, and slow to understand. But watching Reyes interact with the new technicians, watching how she inspired respect without demanding it, forced him to confront the way he had approached his own work and relationships. He had been too focused on being seen, too eager to prove his worth to everyone around him. But now, he understood that the real value lay in doing the job well, in showing up every day and doing the work, no matter how hard or thankless it might seem. One afternoon, as Jenkins helped Reyes inspect the F-35's flight control systems, he found himself drawn into a conversation with one of the senior NCOs, Master Sergeant Wilkins. They were discussing the intricacies of a new diagnostic system that had been integrated into the aircraft, and Jenkins found himself listening intently as Wilkins explained some of the finer points of aircraft maintenance. But as Wilkins spoke, Jenkins couldn't help but notice that Reyes was nearby, working with a new technician on the opposite side of the hangar. The way she moved, the way she interacted with the team, was a model of quiet professionalism. No one was asking for her help, but she was there, offering guidance when needed, checking in on the team's progress without drawing attention to herself. Jenkins didn't realize he had been staring until Wilkins cleared his throat, bringing him back to the conversation. "What's got you distracted?" Private Wilkins asked, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. Jenkins flushed, caught off guard. He hadn't meant to zone out, but it was hard not to notice the way Reyes carried herself. "Just thinking," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a newfound respect. Thinking about what Wilkins prodded, Jenkins hesitated. "About Reyes," he admitted. "She's something else, isn't she?" Wilkins chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with the kind of respect Jenkins had never seen in his superiors before. "You have no idea, kid. She's been at this for longer than most of us have been in the military. There's a reason people don't mess with her, but she doesn't wear it like a badge. She doesn't need to. She just does the job." Jenkins nodded, his thoughts swirling as he looked back at Reyes, still focused on her work. For the first time, he saw her not just as a woman with scars, but as someone who had earned every bit of respect she had. She wasn't looking for recognition. She didn't need it. She had already earned it through her actions, through the quiet confidence she brought to every task. No matter how small or large, the more Jenkins observed her, the more he realized how much he still had to learn. He had spent so much of his time trying to prove himself, trying to be someone he wasn't. But Reyes didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She had let her work speak for itself, and that was what made her strong. Over the next few days, Jenkins found himself paying closer attention to his own work. He no longer sought out praise or recognition. Instead, he focused on doing the job to the best of his ability. No matter how mundane the task seemed, he took pride in the details, in the work that no one else would notice. Slowly but surely, he began to understand that this was where true strength lay, not in boasting or trying to stand out, but in quietly doing what needed to be done. With respect for those around you, Reyes had taught him that. Her quiet strength had shown him what it meant to be truly capable, and it had nothing to do with seeking the spotlight. It was about integrity, humility, and a deep commitment to the work at hand. Jenkins still had a long way to go, but he was learning, and that, he realized, was the beginning of real growth. As the days passed, Jenkins began to interact more with Reyes. His respect for her wasn't just a quiet admiration from a distance anymore. He spoke with her when they worked side by side, and while their conversations were brief, they carried more weight than anything he had said before. He didn't need to impress her. He simply needed to do his job and do it well. The hangar, once just a place of work, now felt like a place of learning, where Jenkins began to see strength in a whole new light. And as he watched Reyes quietly lead the team, day after day, he realized that the true measure of a soldier wasn't in how loud they could speak or how much they could boast. It was in how they quietly went about their duties, leading by example, earning respect not through force, but through action. And in that realization, Jenkins found the path forward one step at a time. The weeks passed, and Jenkins found himself increasingly quiet as he worked through the motions of daily life at the base. There was still a lot to learn, but he had begun to see things through a different lens. His earlier arrogance had faded, replaced with a deep appreciation for the people around him. He no longer sought attention or validation from others. Instead, he focused on the tasks at hand, quietly working alongside his team, doing the job because it was the right thing to do, not for recognition. Reyes had taught him that. Jenkins had long since stopped making jokes at her expense, And in fact, he had begun to notice how everyone else treated her. They respected her, not because of her rank, but because of the integrity she brought to everything she did. Whether she was working with a crew on an F-35 or reviewing maintenance reports, there was no pretension about her. She didn't need to brag about her accomplishments. She didn't wear her past as a badge of honor. She didn't ask for applause, and yet, somehow, she earned it every day without even trying. One afternoon, Jenkins found himself working on an engine diagnostics report. He was focused, his hands moving methodically as he cross-checked the components against the list. As he worked, he could hear the steady hum of the hangar in the background. His thoughts drifted to Reyes and everything he had learned from her. It wasn't just about fixing aircraft or knowing how to solve a technical problem. It was about quiet strength, about doing your job with excellence, and letting your actions speak for themselves. There was something profoundly humbling about that, about knowing that the real heroes weren't the ones whose names were splashed across headlines or whose medals caught the light at formal events. The real heroes were the ones who did the hard work, day in and day out, without fanfare, without asking for praise. Later that day, Jenkins found himself in a conversation with Master Sergeant Wilkins. The older man was talking about the routine of life on the base, but Jenkins's mind was elsewhere, still reflecting on his own transformation. "You know, Sergeant," Jenkins said, breaking the silence, "I used to think heroes were the ones who got all the recognition, the ones whose stories were told and retold, the ones everyone knew about." Wilkins looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "You're not wrong," he said, "but the ones who never seek recognition, the ones who just do the job, the ones who keep things running smoothly, those are the ones who really make a difference, the ones who change things, but you'll never read about them in a history book." Jenkins nodded, the weight of Wilkins' words settling in. It was exactly what he had been coming to understand over the past few weeks. Heroes didn't always make headlines. Sometimes they were the ones who simply showed up, did the work, and quietly went about their business without needing applause or admiration. They were the ones who carried the weight, not for the glory, but because it was the right thing to do. And, as Jenkins had learned, those were the heroes who earned true respect, the kind that mattered. As the day wore on, Jenkins caught sight of Reyes, standing by one of the F-35s, her hands moving over the aircraft with careful precision. The sunlight filtered through the hangar doors, casting a soft glow on her figure as she worked. She didn't need to be noticed. She didn't need anyone to see her as anything other than who she was, a professional, a leader, a quiet force. And yet, she commanded respect in a way that was far more meaningful than anything the loud, brash soldiers around her could achieve. Jenkins paused for a moment, watching her from a distance. He felt a surge of respect for her, something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just about her being a military legend. It was about how she carried herself every single day, with humility and integrity. She wasn't a hero because of her past, but because of how she continued to live and work without seeking the recognition she deserved. And that, Jenkins realized, was the essence of real strength. As he stood there, a thought crossed his mind. He had spent so much time looking for external validation, striving to be seen, to be noticed, but he had been missing the point. True strength wasn't about what others thought of you. It wasn't about how loudly you could boast or how many medals you wore. It was about doing the work, day in and day out, with humility and respect. It was about having the courage to stand quietly, to be competent and skilled. Even when no one was looking, Reyes had shown him that. The days passed, and Jenkins continued to evolve. He worked harder, focused more, and started to find a deep sense of satisfaction in the small victories, the tasks completed, the problems solved, the respect earned from his peers. But more than that, he had come to understand the power of humility. He no longer sought to impress anyone. Instead, he focused on doing the right thing, doing the job with integrity, and letting his actions speak for themselves. One evening, as Jenkins was finishing up his shift, he found himself standing outside the hangar, looking out over the base. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the runway, and the world felt still, almost peaceful. Jenkins thought about everything that had brought him to this point. His earlier arrogance, his mocking attitude, the way he had misjudged Reyes, all of it felt distant now, like a lifetime ago. He had changed, not because someone had forced him to, but because he had learned the value of quiet strength. As he looked out at the base, Jenkins realized that the real heroes weren't the ones in the spotlight. They weren't the ones making grand speeches or seeking validation from others. The real heroes were the ones who kept the world running, who quietly did the hard work, and who earned respect through their actions. Reyes was one of those heroes. She had taught him that, and now, Jenkins understood that he could be that kind of hero too. He had learned the lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Heroes weren't always the ones who sought the spotlight. Sometimes, the real heroes were the ones who chose to stay in the shadows, doing the work with quiet competence and unspoken strength. And for the first time, Jenkins felt ready to step into that role, not for recognition, not for glory, but because it was the right thing to do. As he turned to leave the hangar, Jenkins took one last look at the place that had changed him. It was no longer just a workplace, but a place of learning, growth, and quiet strength. He was no longer the person he had been when he first arrived. He was someone new, someone who understood that true strength came not from being seen, but from simply doing the work and doing it well. And in that quiet realization, Jenkins took his first step toward becoming the kind of soldier Reyes had always been, the kind of hero whose deeds spoke for themselves.